Hello, students, and thank you for joining me again um, for establishing classroom limits and what those are in this sequence of understanding what quality looks like in our center. So we're going to explain the reasons for having classroom limits. We're going to list those limits and describe methods that are actually the quality methods that you need to start modeling in your classrooms by enforcing limits and watching master teachers around you who have their CDAs, who have their Associate of Applied Science degree, and actually learning how those are useful and why they have those there, not just to be pretty little things in their classrooms, but actually what do they do? Because the last section that you're going to be listening to is actually me talking about classroom management skills. Um, so first of all, what are limits? Limits are necessary to help children effectively work in groups. And we want that social emotional interaction to take place because of school readiness. So in order for that to happen, they need to be part of a group. Now, one of the things that you will hear when you begin to explain to parents about their child's behavior, they'll say, "Oh, but they don't do that at home." Well, normally that's because they're not in a group. They are either by themselves or they're with their siblings and they're not in a large group. So you will hear, if you look at vision and mission statements of public school systems or um, established child development centers, they will say, and this is part of the NACI Code of Ethics too, that they will say that we need to encourage children to be productive citizens of the United States of America, which means they need to work in a group and function in society respectfully and responsibly. So respectfully means that they respect laws, they respect limits. Responsibly means that they pick up their toys, they become responsible children in their behaviors, they take um, they understand that when they do something wrong that they take the responsibility for it instead of lying and saying I didn't do that, it's not my fault. Do you see what we're trying to establish? We're trying to establish those patterns in their life that break poverty in their life when they turn 18. They live with these toxins in their families. A lot of times when they are in positions where their family doesn't have that responsibility, doesn't want to take responsibility, and doesn't respect property, doesn't respect other people's feelings emotionally, physically, or socially. So in our child care centers, these effective limits are actually empowering our children to become productive citizens of the United States. And we don't want to shorthand them or shortchange them by not helping them learn those skills that are necessary. Head Start does a wonderful job in their classrooms promoting this type of behavior. Um, so our limits should focus on actions and they should focus on behaviors that reflect our goals of how we want them to be as productive citizens. So as a teacher, you are actually having a huge impact and suggesting how these children are going to respond emotionally, how they are going to respond physically, how they are going to respond their transactions or their relationships, their communication patterns with as adults. Oh wow, can you only imagine the impact that you have on the future of these children? So every area of your classroom needs to be producing limits. As a classroom teacher, it is your responsibility to explain and enforce those limits. And if you do not, you are not doing your job. You also need to explain to children at the child's level of understanding. Now, a lot of times, even your staff members, if you're a lead teacher and you have a floater in your classroom or an aide, you have to explain how important that these limits are. Limits should also be posted in the teacher's lounge in every classroom so that we're all doing the same thing, we're all on the same page. Okay, so we know the reason now why we should establish limits, or what limits are, I'm sorry. But there are 3 reasons for establishing limits. Number 1, according to the law, children's health and safety must be protected. So limits are boundaries that a teacher establishes to help children know what the appropriate behavior is and what your expectation is. Now within this, when you set those limits, you are taking the biasness out of it. You're saying that every child in this center must adhere to these limits. Second of all, children feel free to explore. Remember me saying that? When they feel secure, when they feel safe, they begin to explore their environment more because they're protected from mistakes, and they realize this is my boundary, so I can't go beyond that, but I can go all the way up to it. And lastly, as children develop their self-control, they gradually come to learn that limits are a part of life. So they become citizens of the United States of America, where people are free unless they disobey the law. And then guess what happens? They go to jail. So establishing limits will help your children in your classroom become those productive citizens and reach their goals. So let's talk about how to establish those limits. Well, you need to make sure limits are short and they're positive. When you picture a child's brain, a child hears what the words that you are saying, and in the processing or the cognition of what's happening, those words stick. They become pictures in their brain. So if we're constantly saying negative thoughts or negative words to them, like, would you stop running? Now, there's really nothing wrong with that. But because we know the way children think, we need to say that in a positive way because we want the positive to be reinforced in their brain. So that's why we say, instead of stop running, we say please use your walking feet, because we want walking feet to be imparted in their brain. We want it to be pictured, imparted. Sorry, I said the wrong word. Imparted into their brain. Okay? So that's the number 1 rule. You set limits short and you set them positive. They also need to be in a language that children are familiar with. In other words, you can't say, some big scientific word for sit down. Or you cannot say it in Spanish and expect them to understand it. But again, you can't expect a Hispanic child to listen to it in Chinese or English when they speak Spanish. So we need to avoid not using familiar language. So maybe the use of pictures is what we need to use. And we also need to make sure that we describe exactly what behavior we want as the outcome. So those are the guidelines for establishing limits. How do we enforce them? See, I see so many teachers. Yes, we know it's important to establish limits. Oh, we know how to set limits. We know how to be positive. But you don't know how to enforce it. Or you enforce it on one child and you don't enforce it on another. Oh my, that's wrong. We can't do that. We have to enforce it consistently. That means that the consistency of the limits are established for every child, and they're the same for every child. Consistency helps children know what is expected of them. However, children will test these. Some children are more strong-willed than others. But as you're consistent in enforcing them, it becomes a routine. When that routine happens, it becomes a habit. Enforcing limits also requires that sometimes you have to be flexible. For instance, your limit states that children are expected to wear their smocks in the art area. So if an art activity is not messy, you might be flexible about the limit and allow the children to work without the smock. But your limits must be flexible enough to handle these types of situations. Okay? Same's true with your guidance. You have to be consistent, but you also have to be flexible. Now, in your different centers, you have your sensory play, you have dramatic play, you have your small manipulatives area, you might have cooking, you might have block building, music, your book corner, art, science, sandboxes, all those different types of things, but each one of those centers must have limits in them. Limits are your ways of communicating to your students your expectations. Categories include being safe, being responsible, being neat, and being responsible. Those are the things that you need to instill in your children. Let me say those again. Number 1, to be safe. Number 2, be kind and respectful. Number 3, to be neat and responsible. This is how we take care of our classroom. This is how we manage our classroom. As teachers, we are managers of our classroom, and this is where you get into children not tearing a room up because they become respectful of the room. They understand where toys go. They understand what is happening. So, how do we do this? We do this by pictures. We do this by words. If you have a dump truck and you want it to sit in a certain area, in your block area, then you put a picture of that dump truck there. And you expect that child to put that dump truck where that picture is. That's what I'm saying. So, when we look at our environmental rating scales, the ITERs and the ECHRs, the expectation for quality is that you begin to place pictures, words, whether it's in Spanish, whether it's in Mandarin Chinese, whether it's in Norwegian, Swedish, Russian, whatever, because we're adding diversity into our classroom. That expectation is there, plus the picture, plus the organization, and then the enforcement of your limits. Thank you so much, and I hope you learned a lot from some of the things that I'm telling you.